All right, Benjamin V has a question for you. He said, a friend is 60 and retiring this year. He is a very conservative investor. He's considering investing in Nvidia due to a strong historical gain. How should he think about this? For some context, he gets very nervous when the market is down 5 to 10%. But at the same time, he fears missing out on returns. I think he's chasing the hot dot. What do you think?
All right, let me do the good financial advisor disclaimers here. We can't give specific investment advice, so nothing we're going to say here could be construed as that, and we obviously don't talk about individual securities a whole lot. But Nvidia stock is an interesting one, right? Have you watched it? Have you looked at it over the past couple of years? Have you watched what it's doing, especially as we've had some of the AI stuff come on the scene? Like, it's wild. It's a super volatile, all over the place stock that goes up and down, up and down, up and down. Here's what I think is really interesting, Benjamin. We cannot say for sure whether Nvidia stock might make sense in your friend's portfolio or not in their portfolio, because it would depend. How much? What's the rest of the portfolio look like? What kinds of accounts does he house? Where's his cash flow coming from? And there's a whole litany of questions we have to go through. I do think it's interesting, though, if you're saying that this friend is thinking about putting a lot of their wealth in this individual security because they've seen a historic track record, that does sound a lot to me like someone who's chasing the hot dot. Now, Brian,
and also, trees don't grow to heaven.
Well, here's my question for you. In your assessment and the clients that you've worked with over your career, how accurate would you say that clients are in assessing their own risk tolerance? Like, meaning, do they recognize their own internal biases when it comes to investing? And can you think of any examples of someone?
I know, because you're one of my early clients back in 2002. This client signed up, and if anybody, just taking you back in time, stock market was pretty dreadful. 2000, 2001, 2002. It was all the dot-com bursting of the bubble. And so 3 years, I mean, that's a lot from a behavioral standpoint to have 3 negative years in the financial markets. So I picked up a client in 2002. They were 2 educators, and they were scared. I mean, really scared. They came in, I could tell that they were so nervous about investing. And it sounds very similar to your friend, Benjamin. So I worked with them. We worked out a diversified portfolio that was not only going to capture some of the upside, but it was also going to, pay a lot of respect to their fears and concerns, so that if we did have continued volatility, they would have a portion of their assets that would stay pretty anchored to keep them safe. Well, then 2003 happens. And if you don't know, the downside of 2002, the bottom of the market was around that October-November period. And then once it does what markets do, when they get to the capitulation point where the markets are at crazy good valuations, it's almost like all of a sudden everybody says, you know what? I think
I'm tired of the market being down.
I'm tired. And then the market just takes off like a rocket ship, and it makes a lot of money. And that's what happened in 2003. The markets were up over 30%. This client did great. They made over 20% in their diversified portfolio. And it was so night and day for me when I had that update meeting with that client, is that you could tell he was so optimistic. Now he's like, man, I made so much money. I've never made this much money investing. This is the great. He thought I was brilliant, by the way, which I didn't want to break it to him that it was sometimes.
No, it's because we're geniuses.
It's better
to
be lucky than good sometimes, is that the timing worked in his favor. But then he immediately said, hey, why don't we kick it up a notch? I really enjoyed how much money I made last year. I think we ought to have a little more equity in here to take advantage of even more of this. And I had to quickly remind them, and I brought up some of the questions I'd asked them during the interview. I reminded them of their original core goals. And I showed them, hey, I was like, do you remember how petrified you were and how susceptible you were to let your emotions overcome you to sell at the world's worst time? I was like, you were feeling it's always the fear and greed, those weird, strange bedfellows that just tear all of us humans apart. And if you haven't done enough to mature your emotions, to know how investing pulls on those things and gets the worst of us when we're scared and we want to seek comfort as much as possible, as well as the worst of us on the greed side of it. And that's where Nvidia right now, because there is some crazy technology stuff going on, and they are the leader on getting those chips out and taking advantage of all the computing power. But it is one of those things where I feel a lot of FOMO in this, and I'm not going to, because I mean, it could make a great investment, but I wouldn't do this. This is back to the vacation money over, your eating money. So this should not be the core of his investments. This should be the speculation or the gambling bucket. So if he wanted to go buy a few percent to dabble in it, but as soon as he goes whole hog and tries to just capture, because this is going to be the answer to all of his prayers, I think he might find that letting the emotions or the greed of the situation is going to come out a lot emptier and potentially create a lot more risk than is acceptable.
Or you can approach it from like a logic standpoint. Say, hey, I don't know if Nvidia is going to be the best performing stock or the worst performing stock over the next 5 to 10 years. But man, if you want to have exposure to that stock, you want to think about maybe buying that stock and like 499 of its best friends, right? Because there are indices out there that exist that will get you that exposure where you don't have to pick the horse that's going to win the race. You get to just buy the race, right? You get to have all of them. That's why beautiful things like low-cost indices like the S&P 500 will give you exposure to those companies that are performing well and that will continue to last into the future without having to bet so heavily on one. But I would even get into like specific investments before I backed your friend back and say, hey, based on where you are, you're 60 years old, you're about to retire, what portfolio makes sense for you when we look at risk on, risk off proportions? Once you've defined that, then you can dive into actual security fund and asset allocation selection.